I'm here today with Victoria Loorz. Victoria is the author of a new book titled Church of the Wild, How Nature Invites Us into the Sacred. Victoria is a spiritual director and co-founder of the Wild Church Network and Seminary of the Wild. She's founding pastor of the Church of the Wild in
Oh, hi.
Sorry about that. Ojai, California, and Bellingham, Washington. She earned her MDiv from Fuller Seminary and has a background in strategic planning, product development, and marketing with large organizations like the Walt Disney Company, WellPoint Insurance, and World Vision. She's become a leading voice for including the natural world as a companion in the spiritual journey. Victoria's work and ministry have been covered by Spirituality and Health, Religion News Service, and many other outlets, and she began the research for this book with a grant from Louisville Institute's Pastoral Study Program. Victoria lives in Bellingham, Washington, and you can learn more about her at victorialoorz.com. That's VICTORIALOORZ.com. So Victoria, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Brian. I'm happy to be here.
As I was mentioning before we started the interview, I just really enjoyed reading your book.
Thank you.
I made it a priority on my vacation to make sure that I read this book. And
it's a good one to read on vacation, especially if
That's
you read it outside in a hammock.
That is my vacation, is reading, almost. But in any event, before we get into the book, maybe you could share with folks more about your background. You've got, a lot of different experiences.
Yeah, that bio is kind of funny because that feels like a lifetime ago that I was in the corporate world. But I've spent an aggregate of, almost 30 years in and out of the church as a pastor, and a dozen or more years as a leader of a nonprofit organization in the climate movement with my son that I started with him. And so in both of those journeys, I was seeking to be able to do something that I couldn't articulate then, but I can articulate now looking backwards, because life is sort of like that. You can see it better when you look backwards. And I've been on this journey for the last 30 some years to reconnect our spirituality with the natural world, both from the side of the church and from the side of the environmental movement. And long story short, I hit burnout in both of those roles. I was able to, there's just something built into both of those roles. Being called into work of as a transformation agent, perhaps is a good way to say it. But there's just something built in. It's not linear. You can run these campaigns in the climate movement and raise a lot of money and get a lot of people involved, and maybe you'll be able to change a little local legislation, but the CO2 levels keep going up, that kind of thing. So there's something just kind of built in that leads to burnout, that you're looking for change, and yet you're not going to see that change within your lifetime, perhaps. And for me, when I hit the burnout, both as a pastor several years ago and as a sort of movement leader, I found myself being drawn to this particular tree, oak tree, and they're just having nothing to give, just being in that empty place. And it was there that the story started to reshape within me, that there's something we're missing by being disconnected, divided from the rest of the natural world. There's something that not only is dangerous to the natural world, but is also dangerous to us as humans and to our spiritual lives. And that became sort of that moment, that fulcrum moment where I started to investigate, why is this so separated? Why are we so separated within the church from the rest of the natural world? And why are we so, even within the climate movement, faith communities were seen as somebody else to get involved in our movement,
Interesting.
versus really seeing that, there's a humongous need for the church to be involved in as a safe place to process the grief that comes up with as you tap into the ecological devastation that's
Mhm.
happening,
Mhm.
much less the really unseen but very felt loneliness that we feel as a species by being disconnected. And we don't even know that we're disconnected anymore because it's been so many generations that we've lost kindred relationship as sort of Western white European immigrants,
Mhm.
that our indigenous brothers and sisters, or like the Celtic Christian tradition and some other traditions like that, haven't really lost their connection with the
Mhm.
natural world.
Mhm.
So I'm not sure if that
So,
really answered your question.
well, it just, it gives good context, for how you got here, so to speak. um, but, you obviously were heavily involved in several different things, as you mentioned, particularly the church and climate activism. But this book just recently came out. Did
Hmm.
you write books previously when you were in
Well,
this other, or is this the first one?
this is the first book that I've got that's been published. I've written a lot of proposals, a lot of white papers, the kinds of things that you don't get to edit after the deadline. I loved that I get to rewrite this now after the first draft. That was fun.
So, what was the process of this book happening then? What motivated you to write it? And how did it come together?
Well, it was part of my awakening of this unnecessary disconnection from, my tradition was Christianity, the unnecessary disconnection from nature that my spiritual tradition lived in. Like my experience of the sacred throughout my life was most real in connection with the natural world. And yet, when I became involved in the church in my 20s, that was clear. It was in an evangelical community, and it was clear to I was told God is not in a tree. That's pantheism or something like that. Like there were pejorative names for experiencing or worshiping God in nature, and it just didn't make sense to me. But my first job out of seminary was working with an evangelical organization called World Vision that does relief and development work internationally. And my role was a research and policy development director, and I would research different global issues and write white papers and recommendations and things like that. And the whole time I was pregnant with my son, I wrote about the impact on marginalized communities of ecological devastation, how that impacted them. And that was really my first awakening to go, oh, there's something here. Because I approached it in a way of like, this is not a liberal agenda. This is part of our own tradition. And so that began my curiosity. And, so it's just kind of like my invitation in was experiential as a before I connected with the Christian church, and then it was kind of almost academic. And then as I after that, I became a pastor, and I kept trying to be involved in parts of the church that would bring people into direct communion with God versus talking about God. And so I did things like centering prayer and experiential labyrinths and all kinds of stuff like that. And that was always that transformation was always at the core of what I wanted to do as a pastor. But it was great. It was interesting, and people liked what I did, but it didn't really seem to. There was something always blocking. There was something always in the way of that transformation for people. And then I basically burnt out and left the church you know, for 7 years. I left completely. I left being a pastor. I left going to church. And that's when I did this nonprofit work with youth in the climate movement. And there was, it was all about legislation. It was all about movement and we're going to do this and turn off your lights and don't drive SUVs and that kind of thing. But there was still something missing, and it wasn't until that burnout that tree moment I told you about before really happened. And so that's when I started to recognize and investigate and say, wait a minute, that work I used to do with the environment, which what I called it then, is connected with my spiritual journey, and I'm missing something here. And so I started to investigate and see, is this really, not outside of my tradition? Is this something that I can no longer be a Christian and or identify as a Christian, and at the same time love the natural world and be involved in work that protects and is in relationship with not just as a steward, but in deep relationship with these more than human others that are my home. And that's when I started to discover that no, actually, this connection is deeply woven into my own, spiritual tradition. It's deeply woven into both the, what we Christians call the Old Testament, as well as the New Testament. It's every single. I started looking at it with different eyes. Like I had a new lenses to read those old myths and stories, and that this, my book is called How Nature Invites Us into the Sacred. Well, the sacred is also calling us into the wild, into nature. And every single spiritual leader was drawn, called, pushed into the wilderness on purpose by the holy, by God. Every single one of them. And so, from the people of Israel, Moses, all of the prophets, Jesus, John the Baptist, Paul, all of them were called into nature. And as a pastor, I kept sort of spiritualizing that and saying that was, we have our own wilderness moments, kind of like dark night of the soul. But I was like, wait a minute, this isn't just a metaphor. This is a reality, and the hawks and the soil and the clouds and the rivers played a role. There's something happening in that wilderness that was the intention of God. That's in every single one of these ancient stories. And as I started to do that reckoning, I was able to see these are falsely disconnected. And there's a huge consequence to not only the earth by when we disconnect with something, we tend to objectify it so that we can conquer it. It's pretty hard to deforest an entire acres and acres of land and trees if you have a sacred relationship with them. It just shifts your relationship. It shifts the way you see the others. It's the same kind of divide that we see in our culture against, people pitting against one another in such polarity right now. We have to other the others. We have to call them names and, objectify them and demonize them, in effect, so that we can be right and they can be wrong. And they can, and I get why throughout generations, the wild was a scary place and some place to be feared. But I'm not sure that was always I think humans were in deep connection with nature, were in deep connection with the natural world, and those things that were feared were part of an emerging empire that had an agenda to disconnect people from their land so that they could take it, to disconnect that deep spiritual connection that we humans sort of naturally have with the rest of the natural world. So I really call this work remembering. We're remembering something that's deeply indigenous to us. It's deeply embedded in who we are, in our own DNA. And it's a remembering ourselves as members of of a wider community beyond our own species of interconnected relationship. And now I forgot what your question was.
How did you end up turning that into a book, basically?
Well, then the way, so I was living this and going, oh my gosh. And we can talk about it in a bit, when the idea of logos as a conversation blew my mind. When I discovered that, it was like, this is something that has to be shared. And I had written things throughout my life, and I'd been told a lot, you're a good writer, you should write a book. And so I had been planning writing a book of around this idea of conversation with the natural world as central and core to our spirituality. And my sister and I had been talking about writing a book about this, and but it just never got anywhere. We just kept talking about it, and then all of that journey is relevant because a publisher at Broadleaf had been sort of following me, and she was the acquisitions editor at a new imprint of Fortress Press called Broadleaf that wanted to reach out beyond the Christian audience into sort of more spiritual but not religious people who had there's actually a lot of people in this group who have been in the Christian tradition, but sort of not resonating anymore, but not really ready to leave, and people who have left the Christian tradition, but can't fully disconnect. But this issue of disconnection from the natural world is core to people in that audience. So she'd been following the work that I'd been doing with the Wild Church Network and Church of the Wild and Seminary of the Wild, and contacted me one day and said, have you thought about writing a book? So that's
so
how
great.
it
That
came
is so
about.
great. I mean, within the publishing industry, as you well know from your earlier experience, it's very difficult to get a book deal.
Yeah.
And I deal a lot with people like Valerie Weaver-Zurcher, who was your acquisitions editor at Broadleaf, and interview them a lot about it. And they dislike the aspect of their job where they have to say no so many times. But one of the exciting parts of their job is that they get to be scouts, so to speak. In that they keep their antenna up, and they're looking for certain things, and either topics or attributes or, a variety of things that they're interested in. So, this is by no means the first case that I know of where an author basically was contacted by the publishing house and encouraged, to think about writing a book. So that's really good that, all the work that you did that preceded that, right? I mean, came to that kind of fruition.
Yeah, it's sort of like following your heart, following your passions, doing the thing, and then once you do the thing, then the opportunities to share that kind of do open up a little bit magically.
Yes. Well, I've had numerous conversations about the serendipity
That
of
magic.
things. The magic. So in your book, you make a distinction between of the wild and in the wild. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's so when I first started a community that I called Church of the Wild, I didn't know of anybody else that was doing this, that had left buildings, that were intentional about part of the reason to do this is to reconnect with the natural world as sacred. And so when we started, I did discover the Forest Church movement in England. And I researched, I love the etymology of words. And so I researched where the word forest came from, because I was living in Ojai, California, which is not a forest. It's a chaparral region where there's oak trees and shrub oaks and stuff. And I found out that forest first became a word in sort of medieval England when it was like one of the few places that weren't deforested, so that the kings could hunt deer. And I have a special relationship with deer, so I didn't like that. So I was like, I'm not going to be a forest church. So I don't know. It just kind of the word the phrase "Church of the Wild" came to me one of those middle of the night muse moments, and every word of that is important to me. There's a lot of wild churches that don't use the word church because the majority of people that come to the gatherings are not identified with a Christ tradition in any way, including all of the services that I've led. But putting it with wild kind of reframes it. And it's not just church in the wild. It's not just doing what we do inside of a building and taking it outside and, setting the rows up in facing toward the front and having the one person tell everybody else what they think and everybody else says amen and sings a song. So I'd been doing a lot of deconstructing the worship service as I was working in indoor churches for several years. This was my opportunity to really, really do what I felt called was needed in a worship service, not just to serve the land well, but to serve our own souls well and to really enter into direct relationship with the sacred rather than talk about it. And so Church of the Wild is that the wild beings are the preachers, the co-congregants. They're part of that beloved community. And that the experience is an opportunity to connect with these others as preachers, as co-congregants, as friends, as kin, and to engage in connection and engage in practices that reconnect us in intimate relationship with these others. And so that means learning how to listen to a tree, learning how to listen to, and that's, sounds kind of funny, and we're uncomfortable saying, the tree said to me. But the more theological work that I did to understand the deep interconnection that we have, these interconnected web of all beings, is the presence of Christ. The more it's like, okay, I can just say this. I can just tell people, go out. The majority of the worship services, if we want to call it that, are 45 minutes to an hour of the time where people go out go out from the circle. We sit in a circle. They go out from the circle as a threshold and wander and allow yourself to be drawn to a particular place and settle into that place or before a particular tree or squirrel or whoever is kind of calling you, and just with curiosity and openness, allow it's kind of like, I call it terra divina, like that lectio divina, which is an ancient monastic practice of hearing the holy in the words of Scripture. This is hearing the holy in the words of the first Scripture. It used to be called the first book of Revelation was nature. Not revelation like the end of the world, but of revealing truth, revealing the presence of the holy. And so just in that interaction, what comes to you? How are you able to connect with this other? How can you just really see and appreciate and experience the other as sacred? And what does that say about the divine, the Christ in you, and what's that connection between? Where is that the presence of Christ? And then they'd come back together and share that. And so that conversation, like, we'd learn from one another. So it's not just one pastor, preaching to everybody else what their opinions are, but everybody's part of that. And so it's really in the wild. It's in relationship with the wild that is the vision of this movement.
It's very, very interesting. And so you touched on this earlier. One of your chapters deals with the retranslation, for lack of a better word, from in the beginning was the Word to in the beginning was the Logos. So can you talk about how you found that and what the meaning is?
Honestly, I don't remember where I first discovered it. I think my sister sent me an article. And it was a mind blower. So the Greek word is logos. In the beginning was the logos. So that's the Greek word there. And so I started investigating, what does this word mean? And and found out, that it had been coined by Greek philosopher about 500 years before the Gospel of John was written, and it meant, this sacred aliveness in and between all things. This Heraclitus was the Greek philosopher, and he also coined the word cosmos for the first time. That reality is much bigger than we think, and that all things are connected, and that there's this, and so it's this, and he used the word, and philosophers after him used the word conversation, is what this logos meant. It's the conversation between all things. That there's something in that. And so when the writers of the Gospel of John at that time in the first century in Rome, that was a really common word, logos. They knew what that meant. They knew it meant this conversation between all things. And so the writers of the Gospel of John, I discovered, realized this is a great way to explain what we're trying to say about Christ, that Jesus is the embodiment of this Christ, this sacredness in and between all things. And so it made sense. In the beginning was the logos. In the beginning was the conversation. And the conversation was with God. And the conversation was God. And all things that were created with this conversation. And like that blew my mind because I'd also been researching my sister and I really were researching the quantum physicists were putting the same language to their research to see that at the center of all things, like they were looking for the atom, the smallest possible thing, the smallest possible noun. And they found that it wasn't the smallest thing, that there were subatomic particles, but they weren't really particles. They weren't really nouns at all. They were actually activity. It was actually relationality. It was actually conversation that is at the center of all things. So it's like, oh my gosh, these ancient philosophers, these early, Christian religion, what's the word, theologians, and these quantum physicists, and the quantum physicists were looking to indigenous languages to find verb-based language to describe what was going on at the center of these atoms. Because we are such a noun-based culture that there was no way to describe what was actually happening. And so what indigenous religions and cultures know that all things are connected, that it's that relationality is very a verb-based relationality, not a noun-based worldview. And yeah, so when I discovered that in the beginning was the conversation, it just really blew my mind. And then it was confusing, like, well, why is it translated as word? Because the Latin translation up until the 4th century for logos was always conversation. And, as you translate it into English. But then I started researching what happened in the 4th century. And anybody who knows the history in Rome at the time knows that Rome was kind of a little bit sketchy. They had these 4 different emperors that were fighting for, they were sharing. It was a way to save the empire, was have these 4 different regions. Well, Constantine managed to murder the other 3 and became the one and only emperor. And he sort of adopted the Christian, not so much religion, but the Christian language, and sort of decriminalized Christianity a bit, and used the Christian images on his war sort of banners and sword and shields and stuff, and kept winning. And so Christianity was a good thing, but all of these different people by the 4th century had different ideas of what this new religion was all about. And they were this noun-based Greek culture trying to integrate this verb-based culture of Hebrew culture, and trying to understand this verb-based culture with nouns, So there was inherent differences. And long story short, essentially, what came out of that was a decision to shift the translation of "in the beginning was the logos" from "in the beginning was the conversation" into "in the beginning was the word," the one word, the one, and they had, anyway. So that, and they wanted to shut down the conversation. Empire had an agenda to shut down that conversation. We just want one way because there's one emperor here. And anybody who disagrees is going to be called a heretic and going to be either shoved out or killed or exiled, the way of empire. So
One of the many examples of using religion for
absolutely,
warfare and power.
absolutely, it was really the beginning of using the Christian church as a weapon of mass destruction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't want to spoil the book, for anyone, in particular the parts that you wrote about the deers. But I'd love for you to maybe talk about your first, kind of close encounter, so to speak.
Yeah, it was really I did this theological inquiry, followed experience, as spirituality often does. It's an experience of the sacred that leads into the theological inquiry. And for me, it was an experience with a series of mule deer in the lower Rocky Mountains several years ago. It was part of when we were first beginning to envision Seminary of the Wild. We had been discovering, that deep connection with the natural world was key for transformation. And I'd started to do some of this theological inquiry, and I had suspicions, and I remembered times in my life where I had connected with the sacred in the natural world. But it was this experience that really shifted it for me. We at Seminary of the Wild, the center of it is experiential, and so we send people out into their own places, into their own wildish places, with kind of an invitation to experience that place as sacred, to engage in your own journaling or conversation in relationship with the natural world, and so we were doing this intentionally. We were going out, wandering with an openness to listen for a couple hours at a time, and then coming back and sharing what we experienced. And to make a long story short, 3 days in a row, I had this experience where I was. I'll share the first experience, but we kind of went out there to just wander, and I saw this deer, and I'm like, okay, just not even thinking, I'm just gonna follow this deer, and I followed this deer up a little ravine, and just kind of scrambling. It's starting to rain, scrambling after this deer, thinking by the time I get there, there's gonna be gone. I don't even know why I'm doing this, but get up there, and this deer is waiting for me almost. She's like 15 feet in front of me and just kind of looking right at me, watching me scramble up this hill. And anybody who's encountered deer kind of close up, understands that sort of staring at one another that they do. And I just saw in her eyes very quickly, she moved from, like, are you a predator? To her eyes just kind of like softened and was clear, okay, you're not a predator. And didn't move, just kind of like started, her ears flicked, and she kind of looked around. Started listening to the other sounds, had determined that I was not a threat to her. And then it started to rain a little bit more. I pulled a little closer to her to be under a tree. She didn't move, didn't mind. And so now she's maybe, I'm terrible at guessing space, but about 10 feet away from me. And she looks back at me, and looking straight into my eyes, she buckles her front legs and then buckles her back legs, and she lays down. And I started crying, just like, oh my gosh, this is such a gift to be this close to this wild deer that feels comfortable with me. And yeah, so I just kind of stayed there a little while. It started to get dark, and she was settled down for the night. And after a while, I just was like, oh my gosh, I need to go back. I can't wait to tell the guys about what I just got to experience. And she didn't get up when I said goodbye. I left, and I heard something inside me, which I would normally say, sort of like I heard the voice of God or something in my own voice, within my own, heart. I heard, "I'll be with you always." I was like, oh, cool. I encountered, God here or something like that. The next day, on another one of these wanders, nothing really happened. I'm getting a little bit cranky about it, and I'm wandering back. Oh, and this first wandering was called, having this encounter with your inner beloved, kind of a Jungian term about that part of you that that part of you that never changes, that essence part of you that 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 loved you. And so I had this inner beloved moment with this deer, and I'm coming back. So that's the next day. I'm coming back from my wandering, and I'm like, oh, you know what? In my own head, I'm going, I never called in my inner beloved. And right when I thought that, another deer that looked a little different jumped over the path that I was on and went up another ravine. I was just like, oh my God, if like that tingly feeling of like, what is happening here? I scramble up after her, and just about exactly the same thing happens, where we're staring at we're looking at each other. I'm in the middle of the field. She's over on the side. As she's looking right at me, she buckles her front legs and then buckles her back legs and lays down. And I'm like, what is happening here? And the third day, I see a third deer about to leave where I was about to go home. And a third deer is like way back in the brambly bushes. I can like barely see her, but we're like staring at each other. I'm getting a little bit dizzy, and I feel inside of me like, you know what? I think I'm the one that's supposed to lay down. But this makes no sense because I definitely won't see her if I lay down, but okay, whatever. So I lay down. I'm just kind of laying there going, what is happening with these deer? This is so weird. And this deer comes up to me and looks at me as I'm laying down, and my heart almost stopped. I mean, it was just like, that twinkly feeling where you're like, this is something happening here. There's something magical, mysterious happening. And she looks right at me, and within a short period of time, it's just like takes a look at me, twitches her ears, starts eating a few little leaves, and walks out to the meadow. And I follow her to the meadow, and the same thing happens where she lays down. And I sit in the meadow with her for over an hour, where she's all four legs are like stretched out. Never even seen a deer lay like that. And it was really like this unbelievable encounter where I recognized that was, yes, the voice of God, and yes, the voice of the deer, and yes, the voice of my soul. Somehow mysteriously is that, oh, they just walked up. My neighborhood deer just walked up to the window. And it's Mary, who I write about in the book.
Oh my goodness,
Isn't
yes.
that funny? You want to see her? Yeah.
Oh goodness. Hi, Mary. How amazing.
But it was this, I recognized that this wasn't just a spiritual encounter. It was definitely that. But it was an invitation into relationship that didn't really kindle into actual relationship for quite a while, about 5 years. That you introduced you to Mary, so that whole story is in the book. But
Yes,
but
yes.
it really,
We'll save that for
yeah,
folks,
I
to
won't
be
I
able to
won't
read,
share
because
that.
that's equally as fascinating as what you just shared. But
But it really opened up
so
that reality that this is not just like metaphor. This is not just like an interesting,
mhm, mhm.
odd encounter, but there's something sacred happening that we've been so disconnected from for so many generations that we hardly know how to recognize it.
So before we finish up, there's just a couple other things I wanted to touch on. One of them is you said briefly about the Seminary of the Wild. That's an experiential, ongoing program.
Hmm.
correct?
Yes. Yeah, so we have something called a Eco Ministry Certificate. It's a year-long program. We meet weekly on Zoom, ironically. We meet on Zoom to talk about being outside. And but it's a way to gather with like-hearted others who also feel this calling from Spirit and from Earth herself into a new kind of service to the world. Um, and and it's deeply connecting with your place, your particular place as sacred, not going to, some retreat center and experiencing that place as sacred, but your own place, and
Mhm.
really deepening into relationship with all the more than human others that you are home, that you belong with. And yeah, and then
So,
there's the
so
Wild Church Network.
in addition to that, you also co-lead a wild church network, correct?
Yeah, so
So what is that exactly?
Yeah. So when I started this Church of the Wild in Ojai, I thought I was the only one. I thought it was just kind of like heretical and crazy. Until like about 3 months later, I met Wendy Jansen in Toronto, and she had started a church almost exactly like mine. She was a Mennonite pastor and started it on the side, and then we met others. We met others, and every month we'd meet more and more people, and we'd invite them to a monthly Zoom call. And after about 9 months, we went, wait a minute, this is a thing. And we named it the Wild Church Network. We put up a website, and now there are, a couple thousand people who are starting wild churches, or have started, or are wanting to start wild churches all over Canada and the U.S. and in other countries as well. So the Wild Church Network is sort of a container for that, and a connector, and
Hmm.
building resources, and really encouraging others that they too can start a wild church. They don't have to be a pastor. They don't have to be, within the Christian church at all. But they can start one in their own community.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, Victoria, is very fascinating. I just really got a lot out of your book and really appreciate you writing
Thank
it.
you.
Appreciate you spending some time to tell us more about it. As I mentioned earlier, you can find more about Victoria and her book at, her website, victorialoorz.com, Loorz.
Thank you.
So Victoria, congratulations on that and all of your work. And thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you so much, Brian. I appreciate the work that you do in introducing people to new authors and new books. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Good. Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.